All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fanon, and in this video, we're going to talk about Gary Russell Jr., Al Haymon, the PBC, and Mark MAGSAYO, and the politics that led up to what happened last night where Gary Russell Jr. lost his belt to Mark MAGSAYO. Let's do that in this video. Welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fanon. Before I get into the meat of this video though, please make sure that you support our betting sponsor BUSR at busr.ag/Fanon. When you deposit $10 and wager $10, you will get an additional $150 bonus for wagering once you sign up and you deposit and bet $10 on the site. So make sure you guys do that. But also, make sure that you hit the like button, share, subscribe to the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you can be notified of when we release more videos. All right, man, here we're going to talk about the underbelly of boxing and the part that we know is existing and something that we saw last night and actually play out over the last week or so before the Gary Russell Jr. Mark MAGSAYO fight. And that is what I believe and what I'm hearing from my sources is straight up politics and Gary Russell Jr. not being in the good graces of people in the PBC and them pretty much setting in course him no longer having that belt. But let's talk about it. First and foremost, Gary Russell Jr. lost to Mark MAGSAYO in what I consider to be a close fight, but a fight that I believe Mark MAGSAYO lost and Gary Russell Jr. won. There are a lot of people that keep talking to me about how many punches Mark MAGSAYO threw. And look, you don't get credit for how many punches you throw. You get credit for the rounds you win. And yes, Mark MAGSAYO during the early rounds was throwing a lot of punches and he won and he threw a lot of punches and probably did land more punches in total than Gary Russell Jr. did. But that's not how you score boxing. You score boxing on a round by round basis. And the last half of the fight, at least the last 6 rounds, and I do believe the fourth and the last 6 round, Mark MAGSAYO was swinging at the air and missing. However, something happened in the 4th round of that fight that is where the subject matter of a lot of this stuff that I'm going to talk about comes from, and that is Gary Russell Jr.'s shoulder injury. Now, if you had paid attention and listened to the interview that took place between Gary Russell Jr. and Showtime 2 days before the fight, the day before the weigh-in, Gary Russell Jr. said, I am sure, he's like, yeah, you know, I got a little something here, and I'm sure you guys are going to see it in the fight. So when Gary Russell Jr. threw his right hand, and by the way, a punch did not land, he threw a right hand and he grimaced in pain. That was the injury that he was talking about 2 days before that. Now, and he said that he had an injury that took place about 2 weeks before the fight, and it was a long-standing injury that he knew that took place. So, and what was the injury? The injury was a torn ligament. Now, most times that boxers tear shoulder ligaments before a fight, that fight is going to get postponed because the guy is injured and may not be able to defend himself. But my understanding is that Gary Russell Jr., by an assortment of situations, was basically forced to fight Mark MAGSAYO with an injured shoulder because the PBC had kept him on the bench for so long and refusing to give him fights because they wanted him to give up his WBC belt and move up in weight classes and make room for Mark MAGSAYO to fight for that belt for a vacant title. And when he was injured, no remorse on their part. He had to fight because it had been over 2 years since he was able to get that fight. And then when they did the scoring and the scorecards, the scorecards go to Mark MAGSAYO in a close fight, even though Gary Russell Jr. is the longtime reigning champion. Now, Gary Russell, for his part, from what he said publicly, said that he believes he had won that fight 10 rounds to 2 or 9 rounds to 3. I won't argue that. I can understand how that fight could have been a draw. I think it could have went to Gary Russell Jr. by a round or 2, and maybe by Mark MAGSAYO if Mark MAGSAYO had actually been landing a lot of the punches that they say that he was landing. Now, for the people that come to the comment section and talk about CompuBox and what CompuBox says, or better in this particular instance, ShowBox says about the number of punches landed, dude, that is make-believe. Their CompuBox and ShowBox are people sitting down next to the ringside or on TV pressing buttons when they believe somebody landed a punch. Those are not necessarily the punches that land in the fight. And in fact, in the earlier fight, the first fight of the evening, when King Tug got knocked down by the African fighter that he was fighting, he got knocked down with the jab. And the referee sitting right there did not see the punch land. Looked at the punch be thrown 3 times on television, and still couldn't tell you, still refused to tell you that the punch had actually landed. So if you can sit there and have a ref that's looking in real time, looking at the fight, see it differently than people over there on CompuBox or people on ShowBox, it tells you that that is not necessarily the most accurate system, but more importantly, that's not how you score fights. But I don't think anybody can argue that Gary Russell Jr., as far as the treatment that he has received from the PBC, has most definitely not been on their list of people that they were trying to push. And basically, so people associated with his camp are like, look, they knew for a while that Gary Russell Jr. shouldn't take that fight, but he was put in the situation of having to take that fight because it had been so long from a payday, such a long period of time from getting a fight or a payday from the PBC, specifically 2 solid years. So Mark MAGSAYO, they knew that Mark MAGSAYO and the WBC were going to put Mark MAGSAYO in that mandatory position, and they put him in there against a purposely inactive Mark MAGSAYO. At least that's what I am hearing from the people around that circumstance and how they felt, when they felt things were going on that way. You could see that Gary Russell Jr., but when he missed weight by a pound and he said his scale was off a little bit and he had to go back, and lose an additional pound in order to make weight. Well, now that's your answer about why his weight could have been off, or he could have been look drained, because the dude had an injured shoulder, and when you have an injured shoulder, more than likely is not able to spar, is not able to train, so you add that on top of it. So, but if he was able to get some time and know for sure that he would have been able to postpone that fight and still get it later on, maybe he would have. But my understanding is that, and most likely the case would have been, that if Gary Russell Jr. did not take that fight, number 1, he wouldn't get a payday, and number 2, he would get stripped by the WBC for being too long and too inactive, So he had to take that fight with basically fighting with one hand, and then when the man fought with one hand, the dude still got a bum rap. So at least that's how I say, and that, well, let me say, it's a combination of what people are telling me, and what I'm hearing going on with being said by people I know are close to Gary Russell Jr.'s camp, and just the obviousness of the situation, man. This is just, I think this is just a very, very political situation. Mark MAGSAYO, now I don't mean to diminish Mark MAGSAYO. Mark MAGSAYO is a good fighter. I'm quite sure that they are looking for Mark MAGSAYO to be a star, to be the next Manny Pacquiao, like people have been continuing to look for since they brought Nonito Donaire up as being that, right? So Mark MAGSAYO, congratulations to him to be in that situation. I will be absolutely shocked if Gary Russell Jr. gets another shot at that title, and it may work out best for Gary Russell Jr. in the long run if he's at 130 pounds and they will actually give him opportunities to fight for these guys and fight on a more regular basis. But anyway, that it is what it is. That's my thoughts on the matter based on what I've heard from people. You let me know what you think in the comment section. And with that, I'm out. Peace.